you worry when the winter comes round each year?
Yeah, frightened of it.
Why is that?
Well, I don't... I feel the cold so badly, that's why. I'm all right in this room, but I don't want to go out of this room.
Like thousands of old people this winter, Mrs. Compton Hall spends her days in fear of the cold. She sits so close to her oil fire that she's burned both legs in an effort to stay warm. If the icy temperatures of last winter are repeated, Mrs. Compton Hall, at 82, may be one of the casualties of the cold. Hypothermia kills hundreds of elderly people, but the cold threatens many more old people than that each winter. Tonight, World in Action presents new evidence that many thousands of Britain's elderly die every year because of the cold.
There are really three problems, I think. There's the problem of hypothermia, low body temperatures, which many people die from. There's the more general problem of lots of illnesses and conditions associated with the cold, and several tens of thousands of people die from that each winter. And the third problem, nothing to do with health or medicine, but just the fact that lots of elderly people, several millions in fact, are miserably cold because they're living in very cold homes.
I have 2 hot water bottles and blankets. I'm quite warm at night. I don't want to get up.
Does your room feel cold in the morning?
Yes. I hate getting up. It's too cold.
Every British winter claims an invisible toll of lives, thousands of elderly victims of cold weather, cold housing and cold bodies. It's one of Britain's greatest unreported tragedies, according to social researcher Malcolm Wicks.
We're talking now not just about another cause, another problem, but we're talking about one of the most tragic problems in Britain, the fact that some old people are simply too cold to live.
Ten years ago, Malcolm Wicks conducted the only national survey into the old and the cold with a sample of 1,000 pensioners. The acutest form of the problem is hypothermia.
Hypothermia, let's remember, is a very critical medical condition, and lots of those with it eventually die. So you wouldn't expect to find masses of people. But we found about half a dozen out of 1,000. Now, even that, across the country, represents too many old people. It represents several tens of thousands.
Hypothermia means an acute loss of body temperature, when the inner core of the human body drops below the normal temperature of 98.4 degrees, the vital organs, the brain, heart and lungs, are endangered and begin to go wrong. A drop of more than 4 or 5 degrees can make those organs stop working and cause death. The first research into hypothermia and public warnings of the risks of the cold to old people originated from a campaigning Somerset GP, Dr. Geoffrey Taylor, who died late last year of cancer. But he gave World in Action an interview to be used after his death on what he believed is an epidemic of cold fatalities. He explained the physical effects of hypothermia on an old person.
They get droopy and apathetic. Apathy is the first thing. Then they get a funny sort of whitey color, and then you feel their hands which are cold, you feel their abdomen, their back which are cold, and you realize that they need to be treated in hospital.
Do they realize that they're ill?
No. Many cases, no. They're too apathetic.
At that stage, are they able to do anything for themselves?
Not much. Those are the ones you find dead in houses and haven't been seen for a week or a day or two.
But those who die from hypothermia are not the only casualties of a cold winter. Old people are vulnerable to many other illnesses which can prove fatal, and the risks are greater if they're cold. Malcolm Wicks' survey found many thousands of pensioners at risk.
We reckon that there were 700,000 elderly people back in 1972, and today, given that there are now more elderly people living in Britain, that's probably about 1 million people who are at risk in winter.
But what do you exactly mean by at risk?
What we mean is that they simply have low body temperatures. I mean, the normal body temperature for most of the population is about 98°.4. For these elderly people, they had body temperatures below 95.9. And these weren't just their mouth temperatures, these were the core temperature, in other words, deep inside their body. They were simply very cold.
Last winter was the coldest for 20 years. The month of December was the coldest since records began, so we decided to look at the problems caused by the cold to old people. We commissioned a breakdown of the government's most recent mortality figures, those for the elderly in December 1981. Matching them against daily temperature charts builds up a picture of how many extra deaths are caused by the cold. The freezing weather and high rate of hypothermia deaths were clearly linked. It was on the south coast, where many old people seek a milder climate in their retirement, that hypothermia claimed one of its many victims that month. Mrs. Rosina Pearson had fallen on Boxing Day in her flat at Dolphin Lodge, Worthing. The building's resident supervisor, Pamela Berridge Moulton, visited her several times that day. Next morning, she could get no answer from Mrs. Pearson.
I went up again and called through and said who I was and would she answer, and there was no reply at all. So I realized at that point that I must get the police.
We knocked on the door, was unable to get a reply. We looked through the letterbox, could see no one about. We forced an entry into the flat and then searched through the rooms.
I went with them, and because I knew the layout of it, and we went to the bedroom door and it was locked. So the sergeant said, well, we must look around quickly before I break the door down, see if we can find a key, see if another key would fit. So we went and looked in other rooms. One of them went into the kitchen, one into the sitting room, and I went into the bathroom. And I walked into the bathroom and looked at among the toilet things on the shelf. There was nothing there. And then I looked down into the bath, and there was a blue blanket lying the full length of the bath. And I thought, well, she might have dropped it in there, or the key might be underneath. So I picked up a corner of the blanket, and Mrs. Pearson was underneath it.
She was in the bath.
She was in the bath without any water.
What was the temperature like in the flat?
Chilly, but not perishing. It was a very, very cold day. And of course, she had no clothes on, and she was only covered with a blanket.
I felt her, and she was very cold. I spoke to her, but could get no reply from her. She was still breathing.
So, of course, the police immediately got on with their walkie-talkies to the ambulance people, who came very quickly, and they got her out and wrapped her up in the special way they have with blankets and tin foil, and took her to the hospital.
Mrs. Pearson was admitted with a deep body temperature of only 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees below normal, and almost always fatal. She died later the same day. Despite being active and apparently healthy, at 89, her body couldn't cope with spending a night in her unheated bathroom. Hers was just one of 15 deaths from hypothermia in Britain that day. Consultant geriatrician Michael Green was one of the doctors who worked on the national survey into the old and the cold. We asked him why old people are particularly vulnerable.
Well, they're not always aware of the cold because their own appreciation may be blunted. I feel cold, and they don't. They may actually be quite ill already, somewhat confused, not because all old people are confused, but because, in fact, the cold is getting at them.
The Wicks survey tested the morning living room temperatures in the homes of 1,000 pensioners in Britain. 55% of the living rooms were at or below the legal minimum for factories and offices of 60 degrees Fahrenheit. 75% had room temperatures under 65 degrees, and a full 90% were below the government's recommended level for the old of 70 degrees. All of them had even lower temperatures in their bedrooms. To make matters worse, housing standards are lowest for the oldest people. Another survey found that 7% of all households had no inside toilet. Among over 65s, the figure was 12%, and for the oldest group of all, the over 75s, it rose still higher to above 15%. And older people live in older houses. The older you are, the less likely you are to have central heating. The facts and figures represent a human tragedy for many of Britain's 8.5 million pensioners. For people living alone in damp and draughty rooms, winter brings an added burden with the high cost of adequate heating. Michael Green believes that many are forced to remain cold.
The income of some old people is very low. They may have little savings, and the heating is so expensive, they're scared to use it, they're scared about paying electricity bill, that they won't spend on heating and on food. They'll make a choice and deprive themselves of warmth.
The relatively affluent South Coast retirement resorts are no exception. Old people everywhere are constantly wondering whether they can afford the heat they need to stay healthy. Miss Mary Kenzie, housebound in a one-bedroomed flat, uses electric fires, but the cost is high.
Well, it just depends. If it's very cold indeed, I keep the three on, but otherwise I don't. I just keep that one and that one all night.
You've just had a very large electric bill, and
Yeah.
it wasn't even winter time.
Well, they sent it me, and I've not had it on day and night. I have just recently.
Did the bill surprise you, how big it was?
Well, it did. I was absolutely staggered. And the first one I had, when it was at 189,
£189?
yes.
Ruby Collier is one of the young elderly at 61. She suffers from multiple sclerosis and is static, but it's difficult for her to stay warm and make ends meet.
Ruby, what are the chief problems you have managing on a pension?
Heating, for one thing, which is very, very difficult. I cannot have my heaters up as high as I would like to because I can't afford to pay the big bills that come in.
So what do you tend to cut back on?
Well, the only thing I can think of cutting back on is the heating, because that is the greatest difficulty. But how am I going to cut back on heating when I'm static? I can't move around, therefore I'm going to get cold.
What would you recommend should be done in order to protect people from this acute loss of body heat?
Well, first of all, they want to live in somewhere near 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And they want to have no condensation on their bedclothes and their houses and the rest of it inside. And that means a temperature of 70 day and night. It's a big job. And that's why the Department of Health weren't prepared to face it.
The findings of the national survey prompted none of the effective action that the researchers had hoped to get from government departments and politicians. According to Malcolm Wicks, they retreated from the problems.
In fact, there was a cynical manoeuvre that took place a few years later, because previous to our survey, the government had recommended in a leaflet for elderly people that to keep elderly people warm in winter, they needed temperatures of about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And most experts would agree that that's about the right advice. Now, our survey showed that 90%, 9 out of 10 elderly people, in fact had temperatures below that level. Now, what the government did a few years later, very quietly behind the scenes, was to withdraw that advice.
It was the last Labour government which withdrew the guideline, but the present Conservative government has done nothing to restore it. 2 years ago, the then junior pensions minister, Linda Chalker, argued that minimum temperature guidelines belonged to the world of 1984 and state interference.
Let me say now that I am not persuaded of the universal need for, or even the desirability of, adopting this course. I am one of those who believe that people like to make decisions for themselves.
Pensioners don't always have the money to enjoy that freedom of choice. The 3 government departments which deal with the problems of the old and cold apparently do. We recently measured the room temperature inside the Department of Energy. It was 70 degrees, the old recommended minimum for the elderly. In the Department of the Environment, it was even warmer, 74 degrees. And the DHSS, Linda Chalker's own department, was working in shirt sleeves in a hothouse temperature of 76 degrees. In Britain, the death rate rises in winter and falls in summer. 1981 mortality figures for the elderly show that as the months go by, the death rate climbs to reach a peak in winter. The December figure is almost half as high again as the summer average of 33,000 deaths per month. How many of the extra winter deaths of old people are caused by the cold and could be prevented? Dr. Michael Green.
I don't think we can prevent the cold weather, but we could reduce by several thousand the death rate from summer to winter, the change. It's got to be speculative. I can't answer it, but I think we're talking about a very substantial gain in avoiding death.
So several thousand elderly people are dying simply because they're living in conditions which are too cold?
Yes, and because the cold weather around them in this country means that those conditions are particularly likely to lead to hypothermia.
The minimum temperature each night through December 1981 reflects the hard frosts, deep snow, and continuous severe weather. More deaths are caused by acute winter conditions. So the coldest December on record should have produced a dramatic rise. How many people died from the cold last winter? Dr. Jeffrey Taylor.
My guess would be 1 month would be an extra 10,000. It would be similar to the 3 months of 63. A bit worse. It was the coldest winter we ever had. Probably 12,000.
And would you say that if similar weather comes again this winter, another 10,000 avoidable deaths will take place?
In a mild winter, it'll be 10,000. In cold weather, it'll be an extra 10,000 a month.
Dr. Taylor's claim is borne out by the government's own mortality statistics for the elderly in June and December 1981. In the month of June in England and Wales, 33,000 old people died. In December, 46,000 died. That's a figure of 13,000 more deaths in a single month, a far greater variation than is seen in any other European or Western country. This excess mortality amounts to well above 400 extra deaths for each day of the cold month of December. We asked Michael Green if the cold was the only cause of those extra 400 deaths each day.
Nothing else changes, medically speaking, except the weather. So it does seem very logical, particularly as our weather gets rather wet and humid as well as cold, that we can deduce that those deaths are being caused by the weather change.
The death toll of the cold reaches dramatic levels, but most of the victims die of disease other than hypothermia. There were almost 2,000 deaths from bronchitis among the over 65s in December 1981, deaths from pneumonia just under 6,000, deaths from strokes above 7,000, and from heart disease nearly 15,000. The total number of deaths from hypothermia, though well above average, was only 266. But very cold weather aggravates all the other medical problems and leads to many deaths in addition to those from hypothermia. Dr. Jeffrey Taylor.
You see, why these people die is because cold means they can't cope with the extra strain. Their heart is already damaged, or their brain is already damaged, or they've got lower immunity to infection. And cold precipitates the heart attack or the stroke or the infection.
We analysed the temperatures for December 1981 and the national mortality figures for hypothermia day by day to see how closely those deaths followed the pattern of cold weather. As the temperature dropped, the victims of hypothermia began to be counted. On the 8th, the overnight minimum was minus 0.3 degrees centigrade and 5 elderly people died. The 9th, minus 2.2 degrees and 6 deaths. The 10th, minus 1.5 degrees and 4 deaths. The 11th, minus 1.6 degrees and 9 deaths. The 12th, minus 2.7 degrees and 12 deaths. The 13th, minus 5.1 degrees and 9 deaths. On the 14th, after a week of freezing weather, 16 died of hypothermia. By the end of another week of frost, a further 88 had died. The cold Christmas weather brought a new toll. In the 3 days after Christmas, 39 more victims were claimed by hypothermia. Mrs. Pearson in Worthing was too cold to live, one of those Christmas casualties who died because there wasn't enough heat in her home. Mrs. Melita Harris lives in one room of her large flat. Even that's difficult to heat, but she understands the dangers of being cold.
Well, sometimes I think I better. I don't turn it off. I turn it half down. But I won't turn it off because that's stupid, you know? That's stupid. Because, well, it's silly, isn't it?
What if you got a bill as high as £200, which some people get in the winter?
So, for goodness sake.
But if you did, would you be able to pay that?
Just about. But, don't. Because that's a lot of money, isn't it? With the electric fires, it's the cleanest, easiest, isn't it? And if the bill comes, well, if it comes, it comes, and if I can't have it, then I do without. That's all there is to it. I have to have a few more hot water bottles. You know what I mean?
Do you have any reason to believe that conditions have improved?
No, I think they've got worse. The reason why they've got worse is that they've got less money, the houses have not been so well kept, and they're damper, and they're not being so well fed because of the price of food.
The miserable living conditions of many old people are the result of inaction and lack of interest from successive governments, according to Malcolm Wicks.
I mean, I think what it comes down to is a view from the government over 10 years or so now that the problem would be too expensive to tackle. Indeed, there was an internal memorandum at one stage that said if we give this kind of evidence out to Parliament, and therefore, in other words, if we publicise it, it will create pressure to spend more money to make old people warm in winter.
The research evidence reveals an epidemic of cold-related deaths. The cold can combine with an existing illness to cause the death of thousands in winter. Many old people in poor health become resigned to the low quality of their lives and tragically even begin to despair.
I was ill last year. I had a stroke and my foot's still not right. That's why my eyes gone funny and all that sort of thing. Well, I'm 82, 83. Well, a few years' time I should get all this silly business again. Why not have let me go in the first place?
The problems for the elderly mount up, but even more serious is the growth in their total numbers. In 1951, there were 6.8 million retired people in Britain, but today there are almost 10 million. And the ageing of the population is more dramatic still in the over 75s. In 1951, there were 1.8 million. Today, almost twice that number, 3.2 million.
I mean, if one was being rational about this, one would recognise that the ageing of the population is one of the 2 or 3 most important things happening to our country. I mean, it's as important as unemployment in my view. But whereas we hear about unemployment from politicians and people march in the streets about unemployment and make it a major political issue, the ageing of the population and the suffering with which that is often associated is a silent social problem. It's a private problem. People suffer it in their own homes very often. It's not something which we hear about as a political campaign or as a political issue.
If every pensioner in this country was to get together and voice their opinions, and if necessary stand on the steps of number 10 Downing Street and stay there until their voice was heard, until something was done, maybe then.
What are we going to do, march the streets with banners or something? What can one do?
Well, there are 8.5 million of you. You'd think you'd be a strong force because of the large number of people.
Well, how to protest against it? I don't see it. And I'm not brainy enough for that, dear.
If we're not prepared as a society to tackle the problems of hypothermia, cold conditions, and the sort of miserable housing in which elderly people live, why not all agree not to talk about the problem anymore? I mean, at the moment, it's become an annual event. We talk about it. Politicians sometimes, shed a few tears politically for the problem. They then pass on to what they think is the more urgent, the more real problem. Why not just forget the problem? It doesn't do the elderly any good just to talk about it.
A decade after the only national survey, thousands of old people still die from the cold even in a mild winter. Growing numbers continue to live in miserably cold conditions. Last winter highlighted Britain's neglect of its elderly, but solving the problems is not a political priority.
I think there are solutions, but they're not easy ones in the sense that the problems of cold conditions really indicate the fact that simply in Britain we neglect our elderly people. And we need to spend more money, and I'm not reluctant to say that. We should spend lots more money on the housing and the pensions and the social services that would actually finally attack this problem. But we need more housing for elderly people. In particular, we need more sheltered housing. We need better insulation. And frankly, we need higher pensions. But if we're prepared now to move beyond mere rhetoric, let's actually get the public support for the programme that's needed.